Welcome back. Today we'll cover the fundamentals that you'll need to get started with Bootstrap. You can find a lot of this documentation on the Bootstrap website. All of the API documentation is there, several tutorials about how to use the individual components and utilities and how to install Bootstrap, which we'll talk about today, are there. So definitely use that as a resource as you're working through Bootstrap. To give you a brief history of Bootstrap, Bootstrap was created in 2010 by a pair of developers at Twitter. It's since become one of the most popular front-end frameworks in the world. Bootstrap has had over 20 releases, including major rewrites for version 2, version 3, version 4, and version 5 is incoming. Along the way, it's made it a lot easier to build responsive websites, especially with the changes in version 4. So some of the key benefits of Bootstrap are that it allows for quick startup. There's a lot of things that you normally have to deal with and fix if you're just starting with CSS yourself. So Bootstrap lets you get past those things really quick and gives you a foundation to get started without having to write as much custom CSS. It's built with mobile-first responsive design in mind, which means that there's a lot of utilities that you can use to make building responsive websites a lot faster without having to write as many media queries for different things. You can build a lot of those responsive elements with the classes that are already provided. You still will need to create media queries in a few places, but a lot less than without Bootstrap. Bootstrap also allows for theming. Theming is a really hard thing to do if you're just using vanilla CSS. But with the additional classes and things, if you're setting things up with the Bootstrap classes, it will make it much easier to then come back later and retheme your website, rather than if you're just writing all the CSS by hand. There's also several themes out there that are available prepackaged, whether for purchase or for free. So you can bring those into your website and take a website that starts out with just putting the Bootstrap skeleton in and then make it really look amazing very quickly just by swapping the theme. You can get Bootstrap via CDN or by downloading the files directly. You can go to this download page here, and that will give you some more info about how to do that. So you can get it via CDN or you can get it via download, as we see. Bootswatch provides several themes which are a drop-in placement for the default look and feel of Bootstrap websites. Bootstrap also includes something called Reboot. Reboot's built on top of Normalize, and it provides some tools and some stylings that help take care of the differences that you might see across browsers and devices. So it makes sure that your website appears the same regardless of what browser your users are using. Originally, we used to do this and suggest that the people do this using a CSS reset. The original version of that was to take a universal selector, the star, and then say, let's set the margin to 0 and the padding to 0. That was the original way that we did these kind of the CSS reset idea. As it turns out, that creates a lot of issues, a lot of problems, which then you have to go back and solve. It means a lot more work than it's really worth. So what people started doing instead is we switched over to this normalized CSS, which rather than saying, let's target everything and break everything and then fix it again, which is the CSS reset approach, is break everything and then fix it. Let's say, well, let's just fix the things that are broken, right? Let's not break everything. Let's just fix the things that are broken. So normalized CSS just targets those elements that typically have differences from browser to browser. And Reboot is Bootstrap's kind of customized version of Normalize. Now, you get Reboot automatically when you bring in the Bootstrap style sheet. It's not something you have to add separately, but that also means you don't also need to add in Normalize or a CSS reset because that piece is built in with Bootstrap. So let's talk about how to install Bootstrap. You can either install it from a CDN or you can download the files. We'll talk about here how to do it via CDN. Doing it through downloading the files is very similar. You just need the same files and similar script tags. Your folder structure will just be different. To integrate Bootstrap into our projects, we need to include both the CSS style sheet and the JavaScript script files. So first up, let's look at the CSS. If you're pulling it down from a CDN, it will look like this. You'll see that I'm pulling it down from the bootstrapcdn.com. It's being hosted by StackPath. This is version 4.5 of Bootstrap, and I'm pulling down the minified version. Also notice that I've set the integrity and the cross-origin attributes. Make sure that these are included for security purposes anytime you're pulling something down from a CDN. The integrity, it contains a hash of the file that's hosted for Bootstrap 4.5 of this file here, and that ensures that if for some reason somebody were to put a malicious file out there that's not the original Bootstrap file, that your browser won't use that malicious file. Otherwise, if you don't have that integrity, your browser will just use whatever file it gets. Cross-origin anonymous is also important for security because it ensures that your cookies and other login credentials are not sent when it requests this style sheet. So make sure you do both of those things. So cross-origin anonymous also allows it to use it if it's been downloaded previously. So next up, what do we need for the JavaScript? We need the Bootstrap JavaScript file, but we also need to include both Popper and jQuery because Bootstrap depends on both of those things. And it is important that these scripts appear in this order because there are dependencies between these different things. So Bootstrap requires both jQuery and Popper. If you load these after Bootstrap, then you'll have a problem and the Bootstrap scripts won't work. You'll get errors in your console because they're out of order. So do make sure that they are loaded and executed in that order. So jQuery would be first, Popper would be next, and then the Bootstrap script would be third. You'll need to make sure that all three of these scripts are here, even if you're downloading it and using the files locally. I think both Popper and Bootstrap are bundled with the download that you get, but then you have to download jQuery separately from the jQuery website. Do note here, if you're looking at the documentation, the official documentation of how to install Bootstrap, they will tell you to use the slim version, which doesn't include everything from jQuery. It's a trimmed down version of jQuery. But for our purposes in this class, we'll want actually the full version of jQuery. We'll want the full minified version. So make sure that you actually go grab from code.jquery.com or just from jquery.com, grab the full version, not the slimmed down version. So that'll change your path here, the source attribute, as well as that will change your hash for the integrity. Okay. Now that we've talked about how to install jQuery, let's talk about what are some of the tools that are available. Okay, and the first thing we need to talk about is breakpoints. What are the breakpoints that Bootstrap defines to make our responsive design easy? Okay, so Bootstrap uses several predefined breakpoints and media queries to help you build responsive websites. It breaks the devices down by screen width into a few different categories. So first up, we have extra small, we have medium, we have large, we have extra large. Because it's mobile first of design, we're always saying it's this size or bigger, right? So we start with the smallest devices and work our way up. So for instance, extra small would be the default, and you won't actually usually see the abbreviation extra small. You just know that that is the default size because extra small is defined as 0 or bigger. It's the smallest devices that you can get. Okay. Small devices start at 576 pixels wide and bigger. Medium devices start at 768 pixels and bigger, and then large is 992 and larger, extra large is 1200 and larger. So that's where the breakpoints are set by default in Bootstrap. You can change those breakpoints if you need to or want to change them to maybe some better breakpoints. But in order to do that, you'll need to use the Sass files to modify those variables. You can't do that directly, just changing the CSS with the CSS file. So next up, let's talk about the utilities that Bootstrap provides for spacing out your content. Specifically, we'll talk about the classes for setting margin and padding. So the first question you should ask is, how much space do you want, right? So you want no space, you want more space, you want, a little bit of space or more space, and that determines, which number you pick here. So there's a series of classes for both margin and padding. The margin ones start with M dash and then a number. The ones for padding start P dash with a number. So M0 means that there's no padding. P0 means that there's no padding similarly. And then you go up from there. So M3 is, if I remember right, is 1 rem of padding. P3 is 1 rem of padding as well. P4 and M4 are 1.5 margin or rem. Sorry, 1.5 rem margin or padding, and then P5 is 3 rem, or M5 is 3 rem as well. And then finally, you have down at the bottom, you can set the margins to auto. That would be M auto. So once you've determined how much spacing that you need, whether it be margin or padding, you also might want to ask about which side do you want that spacing on. So if we use the classes that we talked about on the previous slide, that applies the same margin to all sides. So M-3 will apply 1 rem of margin to all 4 sides. P-3 will apply 1 rem of margin to all 4 sides. We can add an additional letter in there to say which side do I want that margin to be on. So for instance, if I just want it on the top, I'm going to write that as MT3. Or if I just want it on the bottom, MB3. Left would be ML3, right would be MR3, or if I want it horizontally, both sides, the left and the right, then I'm going to say MX3, or MY3 would be both sides vertically, the top and the bottom. So I can use any of these classes either for margin or bottom to be more specific and not just set the margin or the padding on all 4 sides. I can set it on just one side. I'd say the most used one on this list is absolutely going to be your MB-3, because that allows you to separate items in a list. So that's oftentimes the one you'll want to use for separating items. There's also a Bootstrap class that you can use to center blocks of content that have a fixed width. So for instance, if I want to say that this element has a width of 200 pixels, or if it's got a width of 20%, either way, I can use margin auto to then center that item. MX auto sets the left margin to auto as well as the right margin to auto. And if you remember, the way that works is ends up taking all the leftover space and using it as margin. So for instance, in this example here, we've set this element to be 200 pixels wide. If I say that this whole window is 800 pixels wide, well, that leaves 600 pixels of available space. If I divide that in half, that's 300. So I've got 300 pixels of margin here, 300 pixels of margin here. That results in it being centered. Now, there is no MX auto, no MY auto that works vertically. If you want to center something vertically, then you do need to use Flexbox. This is a quick trick that you can use if you don't want to go all the way to add a Flexbox container and you've only got one thing to center. Okay. So next question you might want to ask, we talked about how to set margins and padding determine how much padding you want, how much spacing you want, as well as what side you want it to be on. You can also combine that and say, well, I want to change the amount of space based on how big the screen is. I want to change how much margin or padding there is based on how wide the screen is. So here in this example, I might say, well, on small screens, on mobile, I don't want there to be any space, but on desktop, I want there to be some margin. So here I might say M0, that's my base, right? So my base on small devices and extra small devices all the way up through medium, we're going to have no spacing. And then I'm going to override that at large. So at large or bigger, we're going to have 1 rem of spacing. So the combination of these two says for small devices, you'll notice that there's no prefix because that's the default, that there's no margin. And then for larger, bigger, we have 1 rem of margin. I can add more breakpoints in here if I want to. So maybe I want to make that change a little bit more gradual. I might say, well, at small devices, we'll have, and extra small devices, we'll say, okay, well, by default, there's no margin. And then at medium, it goes up to 2. Large, it goes up to 3. And then finally, at extra large, it goes all the way up to 5. So I can use a series of classes like this to change whatever property I need to change responsively. And I can do this, as you can see, I just apply these classes. They're already written. I don't have to add additional media queries to do things like this. So this can make responsive development much quicker because you can do these things without having to go write any CSS. You simply write these classes into your HTML. So next, let's talk about sizing and some of the sizing classes, some of the sizing utilities that are available for working with fluid layouts. Okay. So W-25 will set your width to 25%. W50 will set the width to 50%. W75 will set it to 75%. W100 will set it to 100%. So that way you can quickly say, well, I want this element to be the full width. W100 is your quick shorthand for that. Most of these the 25, 50, 70%, 75%, more often than not, and we'll use Flexbox in those cases instead of, and the Flexbox properties instead of using those classes. So these aren't all that frequently used, but they can come up sometimes. The most often one you see, though, is the W100. Also, we can also configure the max width and the max height using these two classes here. So MW100 sets the max width to 100. MH100 sets the max height to 100. So you can use those quickly to set percentage widths and heights. There's also 2 utility classes for setting the width and height in terms of VH. So min VW 100 will set the minimum width of the element to 100 VW. Min VH 100 will set the minimum height to 100. And that has there's a variety of places that you can use that. And specifically that second one, min VH 100, turns out to be really helpful if you want to have the footer stick to the bottom of the page. Next up, let's talk about how you work with the color palette in Bootstrap and what it provides, because it can make your look nice and consistent if you have some understanding of what that is. But do be forewarned that all of these palettes that we look at are affected by your theme. So there's a variety of colors that Bootstrap provides. You have the primary and the secondary colors, and generally what we use those for is your primary buttons on forms, like your OK or your submit form, your submit button, and then whatever, if there's a secondary button, if there's another action that you can do with the form, we would use that secondary color. You can also use those in a variety of other places throughout the page. Those are kind of your 2 primary colors. And typically you want to make, if you're working with these colors, if you're changing them, you want your secondary to generally be a contrasting color to the primary color. By default, primary is blue and secondary is gray in the default Bootstrap color scheme. But you can change this color palette if you go into the SAS. You can go change these color palettes. But you can also, if you're using a theme, such as we talked about boot swatch themes, all of those, for the most part, will change these colors, this color palette. So do be forewarned that primary is not necessarily blue, secondary is not necessarily gray, but they're the two kind of main colors that you use for your theme, primary and secondary. Success is generally going to be a green. Success is used to indicate that something was successful, so that the result was good. Danger, on the other hand, is generally used to indicate that the result or something is invalid, that something went wrong. Warning is to include is to mark that there's some danger here. Be careful. There might not be an error, but you need to be careful. Are you sure you want to do this? That's what warning means. Info is used for providing informational messages, for saying things like something happened. It's not really a problem. It's not good. It's not bad, but this is what happened. So that's what info is for. Light will give you a light color. Dark will give you a dark color. Those both, again, change by theme. Usually a light's pretty close to a white. A text dark is usually pretty close to black. Neither of them are necessarily exactly white or black, but they're usually pretty close. Text muted is actually a really, really useful class because you can say, okay, this text is important, but maybe I want to put this text here, but it's not as important as the text that's around or that's next to it. So you can kind of de-emphasize that text. And there's definitely places on a form where that can be helpful. Text white will then set your text will set that thing to white. It's worth noting that there is a white, but there is no black, which is kind of interesting, kind of odd in my opinion. It's like, well, there is the dark, which is close to black, but there is no actual text black. So all of these classes that we're seeing here, these are specifically to set the color of the text. All of these colors that you see here are used in a variety of other places in Bootstrap, so it's good to know the palette. If you want to set the color of the text, it's just like this, text dash the color you want it to be. You can also change the background color of an element using these classes. So you saw text color starts with txt dash, these start with bg dash. And for the most part, they're the same, except that there's also a BG transparent, which you can use to set the background to transparent. There's no text transparent equivalent. You can also use these classes, this palette, to change the color of the border. So for instance, here we see border primary, secondary, etc. It's worth noting that these classes only change the color of the border. So if you just set them, you may not see their effect unless you actually have a border, right? So this border class here that you're seeing first, so border and border primary, border sets the border to 1 pixel solid border. So that's why you see it here. Border turns the border on, and then the second class changes the actual color of the border. You can learn a lot more about borders by looking up the border utility page on Bootstrap website, but that's the basics of setting the colors. Next up, let's talk about a few quick classes that you can change how your text is styled in Bootstrap. So first up would be the text alignment. You can set the alignment to left, center, or right using the classes shown. You can also specify breakpoints here. So I might want to say at this size or bigger, it's centered, right? I might say on large screens or bigger, the text is centered, but on mobile devices, it is just left aligned. So there I would say text left and then text large center. And that way I can get those things to behave responsively very quickly. You can also change the capitalization of letters, and this is most often used with headers. So I might say I want the text in there to be all lowercase. That would be text lowercase. Text uppercase will force it to be entirely uppercase letters. Text capitalize will just force the first letter in each word to be capitalized. Now notice here in this example that there are still letters that remain capitalized. The only thing it did was change the first letters to make sure that they were capitalized. So again, these are generally used in combination with headers. Okay. Next up, let's talk about how you can change the weight of the font or make it italic. You can use these classes to change the weight: font weight bold, font weight bolder, font weight normal, which would be the normal weight of the text, font weight light, lighter. So all 5 of those can be used to quickly change the weight of your text as you need it. And then finally, font italic can be used to make your text italic. Now let's talk about some of the utilities that Bootstrap provides for working with Flexbox and creating responsive layouts. First thing you'll need to do, obviously, is to get a Flex container is to change the display property. Bootstrap provides a number of different classes that you can use to change the display. So dnone would set it to none, which means the item is invisible. dinline will make it an inline element. dinline block will make it this inline block hybrid. dblock will make it a block element. Remember, those are vertically arranged. And then finally, we've got dflex, which will change it to a flexbox. So this can be very helpful. dnone can also be very helpful for responsive design because it can allow you to hide things. Because remember, anything that's set to display none is hidden. We can also use these classes with breakpoints. So for instance, we can say, at what breakpoint do I want to change the display property? And I'll put that in here in between. So for instance, let's say at smaller screen sizes, I want to hide this item, right? So I might say, let's start at dnone. And then if I want it to become visible at larger screen sizes, I might say dlarge block. So it will be hidden on smaller screen sizes, and then when you get to larger, bigger, it will be visible as a block. Similarly, I might want to change something from a block at smaller screen sizes up to a flexbox at larger screen sizes. So here I could say, okay, let's start it at a block, and then when you get to medium or larger, we'll change it to a flexbox. Both of those things can be useful, and so sometimes you might start it as none and then go to flex. Sometimes you might start it as block and go to flex, or things like that. Okay. Next up are the classes that you can use to set the direction of your flexbox. So you can say flex row will set it to be horizontal. Flex row reverse will also set it to be horizontal, but in the reverse order. Flex column will set your box to be arranged vertically, and then flex column reverse will set it again vertically, but the items arranged from the bottom to the top instead of the top to the bottom. And then we can also use breakpoints with these direction classes. So I might want to say that on mobile devices, this should be a column. It should be arranged vertically, and then it should be horizontal on desktops. So I might do that this way. I start by saying dflex, it is a flexbox, and it'll be a flexbox all the time. And then by default, it is arranged vertically. It's a flex column. Then here was where I'm introducing the breakpoint. I'm saying at large or bigger, I'm going to say, let's change it to a row. So using a set of classes like this, I can very quickly, without writing any custom CSS, without writing any media queries, I can quickly get this behavior where on small screens it is vertically arranged, and then on larger screens it is horizontally arranged. So vertically and then to horizontal. So this can make your development very quick. And the thing you do need to remember here, though, as you're working through this, remember always that it is mobile first design, right? Think about what it needs to be first on a mobile device, and then scale it up and change the properties. Use your breakpoints to change it for larger devices. You can also set the alignment properties. So remember, justify content sets the alignment along the main axis. So you can set it to start, end, center, between, or around using these classes here. It's worth noting that the Bootstrap does not include a class for space evenly. And the reason for that is that space evenly is not supported by all browsers in the same way. So the other ones are pretty well supported through most browsers. I think all of the ones that support Bootstrap, that support Flexbox nowadays support those. But space evenly is kind of a weird one where it's not as well supported by all browsers, so it's not included. You can also use breakpoints here, so you may want to have the alignment be one thing at smaller screen sizes and then another thing at larger screen sizes, so you can also include a breakpoint there to change it. Remember, align items aligns them on the cross-axis, so we can set that to start, end, center, stretch, or baseline using the classes here. We can also use breakpoints with this alignment just like the other ones. Next up, we can also set align self. So maybe we want to, this is again along, like align items is on the cross axis, align self is also on the cross axis, but you can say that individual items have a different alignment than others. So for instance, here we have most of the items in the container are aligned to the top, but this one item is aligned to the end. So this one's been set to, the container's been set to align items start, but this item's been set to align self end. And again, you can use breakpoints there as well to change that responsively. Next up, we can change the grow and the shrink properties. In general, the only numbers that we really use are 0 and 1. 0 turns the behavior off, 1 turns it on. So if I want it to grow, I'm going to set it to 1. If I don't want it to grow, I'm going to set it to 0. If I do want it to be able to shrink, I'll set it to 1. If I don't want it to be able to shrink, then I set it to 0. So those are really the only two values you need are 0 and 1. And we don't, again, use those with breakpoints. So I can say, here's the default behavior. On mobile devices, maybe it is flex row 1, but then maybe it changes to 0 or vice versa. Maybe it's 0 and it goes to 1. So I can change the flex grow behavior based on a breakpoint. There's also classes for setting the order of items. And you'll see that there's classes for setting it from order 0 to order 12. If you need more than that, then you'll need to write custom CSS for that. You'll also notice in here that there's not classes for negative order values. So oftentimes I'll just use order 0 or order 1, and then if I need anything other than 0 or 1, I'll go ahead and do some custom CSS to get those orders to be what I want them. So you can see I can set all those orders, but I can also include breakpoints as well to say, okay, well by default it's order 0 or order 1, and then at large or whatever it becomes order 2 or order 0, whatever I need to change it to. We'd also set wrapping with these classes here. So flex no wrap will mean that there's no wrapping. Flex wrap will mean that there is wrapping. Wrap reverse would mean that it wraps, but it wraps backwards. So for instance, normally if you're arranged in rows, it would wrap those rows down. But if you're wrap reverse, it will wrap those rows up. Similarly, if you're arranged in a column, it would normally wrap those from left to right. It will instead wrap those from right to left. And we can use breakpoints with those as well to change the wrapping dynamically. Now, we can also set align content. Do be aware that align content only has an effect if you have more than one row of flex items and if you have wrapping on, right? So you have to have wrapping on and have more than one item, more than one row. So we can do that first. We need to make sure we turn on wrapping to use this. And then we can align the items to the start, which means that in the container, we're saying take all the rows, put them at the top of the container. or put them at the end of the container. We put them at the center of the container. Say, okay, or maybe we want to stretch them to be the full height of the container. And then finally, we can create space between them or around them using those classes there. And then, as you've seen with the other alignment properties, breakpoints work as well. So I can say that it should be this on mobile and it should be something else on desktop. So this is the end of the lecture here. We went over a brief history of Bootstrap. We talked about what the key benefits of Bootstrap are. Definitely make sure that that's something you review on and you understand well, because it's always good to know why you're using a particular technology or why you maybe aren't using a technology. We talked about how to both download and install Bootstrap. We talked about that from a CDN perspective, and we briefly talked about that from just downloading the files and including them. We talked about what the breakpoints in Bootstrap are and how that applies to a lot of things throughout Bootstrap and how that really helps us build responsive websites. And remember that they are always mobile first. We talked about the spacing classes that we can use to set margins and padding. We talked about the sizing classes that are available there for setting the width and the min width, and the width, the max width, as well as the max height. We talked about some of the classes that you can do to change the color of items in Bootstrap with Bootstrap. We talked about a few of the classes that you can use for formatting, changing how text is formatted. And then finally, we went over the classes that are available to configure Flexbox for responsive design. See you tomorrow.